Just picking up on what I said at the end of the last lecture. First, the great tales continue, but they may be continued in a quite different spirit from their originals. Continuators may decide to continue in a way that contradicts or even reverses what has been told before. Second, a very productive way of continuing a great tale is to look at it, to see a gap in it, and then to write into the gap. And third, you just can't tell how inspiration will work. Regardless of changing cultural values, someone may add to a tale an element which no one could have predicted, least of all the original author hundreds or thousands of years before. Now, this lecture is about the Trojan hero Aeneas. He is the hero of Virgil's Latin epic, the Aeneid. We know a lot more about Virgil and about the Aeneid than we do about Homer and the origins of the Iliad and the Odyssey. But it's clear that Virgil was trying to continue and to compete with the Iliad and the Odyssey, both at once, a tall order. Going back to my point one about continuing in a different spirit, Aeneas is a kind of anti-Odysseus. Odysseus was a trickster. Aeneas is your archetypal straight arrow, the kind of guy they put on recruiting posters. Going back to my point two, what Virgil was doing was writing into a gap. There's a time gap between the Iliad and the Odyssey. At the end of the Iliad, Hector, the great Trojan hero, is dead, and it's certain that Troy is going to fall. The Odyssey starts chronologically, though as I said in the last lecture, that's not the way it's narrated, with Odysseus already on his way home after Troy has fallen. Homer does not deal with the wooden horse, with the Greeks getting into Troy, with the final destruction of the city. That's where Virgil starts. Though, just like Homer, he tells the story in flashback. Odysseus tells the tale of his Odyssey in flashback at the Phaeacian court, and Aeneas tells the story of his escape from Troy in flashback at the court of Queen Dido. This tale starts with what you might call an enduring straight arrow image. The Greeks, Odysseus among them, have exploded out of the wooden horse, opened the gates of Troy, and let in the whole Greek army. The situation is hopeless. Hector, the dead hero, appears to Aeneas in a dream and tells him to get out. It's his duty to Troy to get out. Aeneas fights his way through the streets, but is unable to rescue old King Priam, or old Queen Hecuba, or the Princess Cassandra. He's about to take revenge on Helen, the cause of the war, when his mother appears to him in a vision. His mother is the goddess Venus, and tells him to think of his own family. So, he makes his way through the burning city to the house of his father Anchises. His father also wants to go back to the fight, but Aeneas' wife Creusa begs him to save their son and her. One more vision confirms that Aeneas' son Iulus must be saved. And so, Aeneas makes his way out of Troy. He carries his old father Anchises on his back. He leads his little son Iulus by the hand. His father carries the household gods. His wife Creusa follows behind. That's the image. The man leaving the burning city with all that's precious to him. But note the order of priorities. 1, old father. 2, little son. 3, household gods. And 4, wife. We might think that this is not the natural order, but then we're not Roman straight arrows. To Romans, Aeneas is behaving as a model of pietas. And that's exactly what Virgil emphasizes. He calls his hero Pius Aeneas 20 times during the Aeneid. Very different from Odysseus, polymetis, man of many tricks. Right at the start of Book 1, Virgil calls Aeneas insignem pietate virum. Virum equals man, insignem equals distinguished, pietate equals for pietas. Aeneas is the man distinguished by his pietas. But what did Virgil mean by pietas? It's an absolutely vital concept in Roman cultural values. Well, pietas gives us our word pity, but Aeneas doesn't show much pity for anyone. In fact, in our terms, he'd be a war criminal. Romans were not big on pity. They crucified people, right? Pietas could also mean piety, and that's a bit closer. But one shouldn't think of it as going to church and listening to the preacher. It's a more everyday quality, not specifically religious. I would translate the word as propriety. Aeneas, very unlike Odysseus, always does what is socially correct. He demonstrates the social values Virgil and his imperial patrons thought most valuable. And these are respect for the past, for age and ancestry, concern for the future destiny of Aeneas' bloodline, which will eventually found Rome, respect for the gods, and last, respect for the institution of marriage. But that last one, like Aeneas' wife fleeing from Troy, comes a long way last. In the confusion of the sack of the city, Aeneas holds on to father, son, and household gods, but his wife Creusa goes missing. Of course, he goes back into the city to look for her, but her ghost appears. This is the fourth ghost or vision to turn up and tell him what to do, and she says, "It's no good. Banish your tears for me. Farewell, and love our child." He tries 3 times to embrace her, but she disappears. One has to say, this is quite convenient. For Aeneas, remember I said that like Odysseus, he tells much of his story in flashback. Aeneas is telling the story of his escape from Troy at the court of Queen Dido. Dido is a Phoenician princess who is founding a new city in North Africa, which will become the city of Carthage. And Dido is a widow. So now she knows this stranger is not only a capital H hero and the son of a goddess, he is also a widower. In brief, Dido falls for Aeneas very heavily, so much so as to forget propriety. The Trojans and the Phoenicians go hunting. There's a sudden thunderstorm. Aeneas and Dido take shelter in the same cave, and Virgil does what Hollywood filmmakers used to do long ago. He averts his eyes and lets you guess what happened next. When Aeneas and Dido are back in the frame, however, what Virgil does is put all the blame on Dido. That day was fatal, he says, the cause of lasting grief. But it's Dido who forgot her good name, nor did she even have the decency to keep things secret, to enjoy a furtivum amorem, a furtive or secret love. No, she calls it marriage, and with that name veils her sin. In an age of very different cultural values, one might well say, hold on here. Aeneas did it too. And Dido may have consorted with Aeneas before marriage. That's putting it politely. But marriage is what she wants. Did Aeneas think she's just a one-night stand? Anyway, people start to talk. The local king, who is contemplating an alliance with Dido, gets to hear about it. More importantly, Jupiter, father of the gods, sends Aeneas a message which says, "What are you doing building Carthage? Your job is building Rome. Set sail now." Aeneas then, note this, gives orders to get ready silently for departure. But Dido, of course, realizes Aeneas answers her reproachful and desperate speech by saying, in effect, I wasn't trying to sneak off, but it looks as if he was. I never said anything about marriage. Anyway, it's not my fault. You're founding a city, I'm founding a city, and it's the will of the gods. Italiam non sponte sequor. I do not seek Italy of my own free will. I may have removed the epic dignity which Virgil tries to give to this incident, but I am not the only person to feel that Aeneas here behaves badly. There's a long medieval poem, Le Roman d'Aeneas, which retells the story, but to a medieval audience, not a Roman one. An audience which has been brought up on chivalry, on courtesy, on the duties knights owe to ladies. Well, to such an audience, Aeneas' behavior was all very bad form indeed. Dido then commits suicide, falling on her sword, just like a Roman would. Aeneas at sea sees the flame of her funeral pyre. Perhaps this is the time to consider Virgil's hidden agenda. Hidden from us may be, very obvious to the people for whom it was written. The Aeneid was written in the 10 years 29 to 19 BCE, before the Christian era. It is very much a poem written for and read aloud to the Emperor Augustus. It was also very deliberately a national epic. Among its goals are the wish to give Rome a noble origin, one furthermore which would have all the prestige of Homer, but not be Greek. And as I said at the start, we can see that Virgil is competing with Homer. Aeneas' itinerary largely follows Odysseus's. He even rescues one of Odysseus' crewmen, whom Odysseus left behind in the land of the Cyclopes. Typical irresponsible Greek, Virgil hints. How different from reliable, straight arrow Aeneas. Episodes like Virgil's funeral games for Anchises follow Homer's funeral games for Patroclus in detail. Boxing match? Check. Running race? Check. Decided by a slip and a fall? Check. Homer's chariot race has become a rowing match, but accusations of cheating? Check. Last boat straggling in damaged to collect a consolation prize? Check. And so on. Virgil is showing he can do just as well as Homer, and at the same time trying to avoid what we call cultural cringe. A large part of the aim, however, is to define specifically Roman virtue, an area where the Romans thought they were much superior to the Greeks and everybody else as well. That's where pietas comes in, social propriety. But pietas also includes social duty, subordinating private wishes and personal happiness to public service, to the res publica, the common good, civic responsibility. You notice, even now, we can't talk about such things without using Latin words. The Romans would say, we invented republican virtue. And whatever happens to our society will still be founded on it. The proudest thing anyone will be able to say, St. Paul included, is civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen. And so Aeneas, for all his royal birth and divine ancestry too, is the, small r, republican hero. He never forgets what he owes to the future of Rome. However, one final part of Virgil's agenda, and perhaps this one really was relatively hidden, may have been to gloss over feelings of guilt. I'll come back to that, but just let me check you out first on the Roman situation in those years leading up to 20 BCE. Rome had been founded traditionally in 753 BCE by Romulus and Remus. There was a belief that it was a kind of overspill or offshoot from the nearby city of Alba Longa. But it did look rather like a settlement of outlaws, bandits, and riffraff. all of which naturally explains the need for a story about noble origin. Romans then spent many centuries fighting their neighbours, the Latins, the Volscians, the Sabines. Remember the rape of the Sabine women? Bandits have to capture women from somewhere. They fought their way up to being top barbarians in Italy, rather like the English did in Britain. And then they ran into conflict with established Mediterranean powers, namely the Carthaginians and the Greeks. The wars against Greece were relatively civilized, but gave the Romans their reputation for never being beaten easily. The Greek Pyrrhus won a victory over them, but at such a cost, he declared he couldn't afford another win like that. That's where we get the term Pyrrhic victory, one which leaves you played out. The three Carthaginian wars were especially nasty, Rome getting a serious fright from Hannibal, and they ended with Carthage completely destroyed, never to rise again. The very site was sown with salt to make sure nothing would ever grow there. Some said that this genocidal victory, brought about by fear and treachery, had called down on Rome a curse from which she never recovered. But curse or no curse, nasty or civilized, 100 years before Virgil, Romans had become top dog, well on the way to Mediterranean empire. This may not have been entirely good for them. The great scholar Gilbert Murray thought that the difference between the Latin epic and the Greek epic was accounted for by the fact that the Greeks had been through the kind of heroic age which I discussed in the last lecture. The Romans, he said, had an almost steady history of stern discipline, of conquest, and well-earned success. But by contrast, the Greeks had, as Murray put it, passed through the very fires of hell. They knew something Rome did not know, the reverse side of glory, the bitterness of lost battles, the sting of the master's lash. That difference, in Virgil's time, was just about to become even more acute. Julius Caesar had conquered Gaul, the Roman civil wars had been terminated by Augustus's victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, just 2 years before Virgil started the Aeneid. The Roman Republic had effectively been abandoned, and the Roman Empire was about to be imposed. Knowing all that, we can perhaps see some of the sore points and the anxieties which Virgil was trying to massage. Should Rome feel guilt over the destruction of Carthage? Not at all. It was all Dido's fault. By her amorality, she had created a lasting enmity. Should Rome feel an inferiority complex towards Greece? Not at all. Our epic is as good as theirs. And as for war guilt, they did it to us first. If they hadn't attacked Troy, the Trojans would have stayed at home, and Rome would never have been founded. More seriously, there was the issue of republican virtue. Rome had been a republic run politically by the Senate and the people. Rome was very proud of having expelled the Tarquin kings. Rome's great strength, very different from the Greeks, had always been its dedication to the res publica, the public weal, the commonwealth. We'd say Rome was distinguished by its social cohesion. Was Rome going to lose its republican virtue now that it was turning into an empire? Not at all. The main republican virtue is subordinating one's private wishes to one's public duty, and that is exactly what Aeneas does. Finally, there's also a very strong sense in the Aeneid of what we would call manifest destiny. What I'm talking about is heavily reinforced by a third great sequence in the Aeneid after the sack of Troy, after the affair of Dido, and this is Aeneas' descent into the underworld, led there by the prophetess known as the Sibyl. Once again, there is a strong sense here of competition with Homer. Odysseus did not descend into the underworld. He only called up spirits from the underworld. Aeneas goes all the way. Odysseus had a magic herb which protected him from the witch Circe, and Aeneas is given a similar magic herb. But his golden bough enables him not only to enter the underworld, but, and as Virgil says, this is the harder job, to exit from it again. So, down Aeneas goes with the Sibyl as his guide. He sees Charon, the ferryman who takes souls over the river Styx. Only those who have been properly buried, though. The rest, the unburied dead, stretch out their hands in longing for the other shore, but Charon will not take them over. In another reminiscence of Odysseus, Aeneas here meets his helmsman, Palinurus, who fell overboard. The Sibyl promises him a tomb. They go on, past the three-headed dog, who has to be fed a drugged offering to send him to sleep. Did J.K. Rowling remember that in the first Harry Potter book? They meet the infant dead, the suicides, those who died for love, Dido among them, but she refuses Aeneas' attempt at apology. Aeneas meets a fellow Trojan who did not escape from the city. And then the road forks. To the left is a kind of hell where sinners are punished, fratricides, misers, adulterers, traitors. To the right are the blissful groves, the homes of the virtuous. But it's a very Roman and Republican virtue which gets you there. Above all, suffering wounds while fighting for your country. There Aeneas meets his father, who tells him that some spirits will be reincarnated once their sins are erased. And he also gives a long prophecy of the glorious future of Rome right up to Virgil's own day. The whole underworld sequence ends with a really egregious bit of patron pleasing. For the last figure Aeneas sees is a youth of great majesty, but a sad face. It's Augustus' nephew Marcellus, who in fact never achieved anything, but died while the Aeneid was being composed. It's said that when this passage was read to the imperial royal family, Marcellus' mother, Augustus' sister, fainted. But Virgil has to work very hard at saying what Marcellus would have achieved were it not for the harsh bonds of fate. And once Aeneas emerges from the underworld, we switch much more to the idea of manifest destiny, as Aeneas fights wars to establish himself in Italy and marry Lavinia, the daughter of the Latin king. One final difference between Greek and Roman epics. The Iliad contains an atrocity, the mutilation by Achilles of the corpse of Hector, but it ends with Achilles handing the corpse back to Hector's old father as if in apology. But the Aeneid ends with what we would call a war crime. Aeneas has overcome his great rival Turnus, who surrenders and asks not for mercy exactly, but for respect. But then Aeneas sees that Turnus is wearing a belt taken from the body of his friend Pallas and cuts him down. And that's the end. Turnus dies, his spirit passes indignant to the shades of the underworld. I did say the Romans were big on piety, not on pity. Well, for thousands of years, Virgil, along with the Bible, was the foundation stone of Western education, even more so than Homer, because Latin remained the language of the church even after the Roman Empire had passed. One major effect of the Aeneid was to make European countries feel they really needed a similar myth of origins, which several of them tried to bolt on to Virgil's story. After all, we know there were other Trojans. Perhaps some of them founded countries as well. The British version of this was what was called the Brutus books, which insisted that Britain had been founded by a Trojan called Felix Brutus, that the old name for London was Trinovantium, and that this must mean New Troy, and that the British were accordingly the new Romans and eventually the heirs of empire as well. They weren't the only Europeans to invent similar stories. So the Virgilian ideology was very powerful for centuries. However, and this is part of what I mean about the legacy of great tales being quite unpredictable, the Virgilian ideology was rivaled in popularity by the Virgilian visions, especially his vision of the underworld, which gave so much to Dante's Inferno, the first part of his famous poem La Divina Commedia. When Dante wrote his poem about descending into hell, the figure he chose as his guide through hell was naturally not Aeneas, but Virgil, because Virgil was the acknowledged expert on the underworld. Later, Virgil guides Dante through purgatory as well, but he cannot enter into paradise because he was a pagan. The Christian paradise of Dante contrasts with, is even in opposition to, the blissful groves of Aeneas, full as they are of politicians and senators and generals. Ideas of virtue change, just like ideas of heroism. However, I'd like to mention yet one more turn of the wheel of heroic imaginings. So far, I've talked about continuation in a different spirit. I've talked about writing into the gap, but I've said nothing about the third qualification with which I began this lecture, the one about not being able to tell how inspiration will work, maybe in ways absolutely unthinkable to the person who originated that inspiration. Could Virgil, or Homer for that matter, ever have imagined someone who imitated their great epics but decided to turn the heroes into rabbits? Well, that's what author Richard Adams did with his novel Watership Down. The novel starts with a little puny rabbit called Fiver having a vision of utter disaster coming upon his warren. He cannot get the chief of the warren to believe him, so he and a few others, led by a rabbit called Hazel, make the decision to flee on their own and set up somewhere else. Two similarities are already obvious. The rabbits fleeing the doomed warren are like Aeneas and his companions fleeing Troy, and they're setting up a new warren on Watership Down. It's like Aeneas founding a new Troy, which will become Rome. As for getting there, well, that is clearly an Odyssey, and it's quite like Homer's. Adams actually mentions the Odyssey twice as he tells the story, but one close similarity is the warren the refugee rabbits reach, where all the rabbits are well-fed and healthy, but also strange, passive. The rabbits in this warren are like Homer's lotus eaters. What they know, but won't admit, is that humans feed them, so they're there to be snared and eaten. Their comfort and luxury carry a price tag. It's death. Later on, Hazel and his rabbits reenact scenes like the rape of the Sabine women, and the long struggle with General Woundwort parallels Aeneas's long struggle against the Latins and the Italians in the second half of the Aeneid. What gives Watership Down its charm, though, is the addition to this whole brew of rabbit psychology, which I'm sure Virgil and Homer would have regarded as way beneath their dignity. But like hobbits, Hazel's rabbits do provide another model of heroism for us. Rabbits are prey, not predators. They're not good at long marches because they scatter, they dawdle, they freeze. But they're more cooperative than human beings. Their weapons are craft and cunning. They're tricksters, like Odysseus, but they use cunning to achieve the goal of Aeneas, to found a new city. Their victory is to survive and breed, and their hero is El Arai Ra, the prince with 1,000 enemies, who in the end takes Hazel to join his great Ausla, not his bodyguard so much as his council, in the sky. Valhalla, it isn't, nor the blissful groves, nor the Elysian fields either. I guess many would still prefer it to Odysseus' gloomy and hopeless heroic age underworld, or Aeneas' heaven, inhabited only by models of republican or imperial virtue. So far in this course then, we've seen a humble hero, Frodo Baggins with his predecessor Bilbo, a trickster hero, Odysseus, and a straight arrow hero, Aeneas. They all have their good points and their limitations. Aeneas' good points are his reliability, his propriety, his concern for duty. Not very popular virtues nowadays, but just as necessary as they always were. Most of us probably think he would be improved by a touch of Frodo Baggins' humility or Odysseus' ability to talk to slaves man to man. But all heroes are affected by their time and place, which makes it all the more remarkable when we see them being adapted. The next lecture will focus on a heroine and on a change in cultural values which would have shocked both Homer and Virgil, and which even Tolkien found difficult to take.